we look at Iraq, Iraq has sectarian and ethnic divisions within its borders. You have Sunnis, you have Shias and Kurds. So um, the Shia population is mostly here. Most of this is actually deserts, not many people living here. And then you have the Sunni Arab population here. And then you have the Sunni Kurds up, or the Sunni Kurds up here. And what happened after the British left Iraq and Iraq became an independent country is that Saddam Hussein was a Sunni and he took control of the government, and the Sunnis basically controlled all aspects of the states. So, the important jobs, roads, infrastructure, the Sunnis ran the Iraqi states, and the Sunni Arab groups benefited the most from the governments, as I said, in terms of like getting good jobs, getting good investment in their areas and roads. And the Shias and the Kurds were marginalized. So there was an absence of a common Iraqi identity because within these states, different sectarian groups were competing for control of the states. And whilst these tensions weren't like incredibly tense during for many decades, there was a sense of tension between these groups that exploded once the Iraqi invasion by the United States in 2003 happens. Now, before this, there was actually a very famous example of how Saddam Hussein's government, which was led by the Sunnis, it dropped chemical bombs on the Kurdish population in 1998 in Halajba. And this was because the Kurds who were operating in this area were actually working with the Iranians who were fighting against Iraq at the time. So within these societies, there was a lot of division. So identity is important for understanding politics in the Middle East. Identity is shaped by common language, culture, shared history, lineage. And identity shapes how you interpret your interests and who you tend to trust and who you cooperate with. If we think about identity, there's a lot of markers of identity. Like when you think about your own national or political identity, some of these things might actually be informing your political identity. And then the effects that these sources of identity have is that you have loyalty and obligations to your in-group, the group that you share these things with. And then, particularly in conditions of anarchy and insecurity, the out-group, so groups are not the same as you. You have deep animosity and suspicion of the other. Now, this is particularly true in the Middle East, where there is high levels of anarchy and insecurity, and that populations are mobilized along sectarian lines. So in the Middle East, there's lots of different forms of identity, such as ethnic, religious, sectarian, political. What's important to know is that people in the Middle East, as everywhere, have multiple identities. So you could be both Sunni and Arab. You could be both a liberal Sunni Arab. You could be a Yazidi conservative. So combinations of identities exist. Now, identity in the Middle East is both trans-state and sub-state, and this is returning to what we're talking about with the Sykes-Picot agreements. That it's trans-state in the sense that common identities spread across borders. So there's an Arab identity, Muslim identity, but also Sunni and Shia and Kurdish identities that just spread across borders. You can see that the Sykes-Picot agreement really doesn't take into consideration the kind of different ethnic and sectarian composition of the populations. So we can see here that there's a huge Shiite population that is in Iran that spreads into Iraq. So that the Middle East, so this means that sectarian ethnic groups support each other across borders and war. So the Iranians will provide support to the Shiites in Iraq, and the Saudi Arabian, so the Sunni Arabs, will provide support for the Syrians, the Sunni Arab Syrians fighting the Shiites in Syria. So this is a real source of insecurity for countries because basically in Iraq, let's say you are the Shiite government here in Baghdad, you don't just worry about the fact that there might be sectarian Sunni extremist groups that are fighting the government, but they also might be getting support from the Sunnis in Saudi Arabia. So what you can see is that the Sunnis, for example, Saudi Arabia provides weapons and money to Sunni fighters in Syria, while Iran provides weapons to Shia-friendly governments in Syria as well. And this happens across the Middle East. Now, the differences are not just, so it's transstate, that the identities exist across borders, but it's also, as I said, substate within the country. So there's a diversity of sectarian and ethnic identities within countries. And these sectarian groups have competition for control of the states. So you can see in Syria that there's multiple different identities, within Yemen as well, with the Shias and Sunnis. In Libya as well, where you have different ethnic groups, and in Iraq as well, as we've seen. Now, what's important is much of this sectarianism is instrumentalized by elites who are looking to expand their power, and they see sectarian identities as an easy way to mobilize the population. So, summary so far. The Sykes-Picot state border created political problems. There was a lack of coincidence between ethnic and sectarian identity and territory. And the sectarian divisions existed within the country, so Sunni versus Shia, and also trans-state identities spread across borders. So the Sunnis in Saudi Arabia help Sunni jihadis in Iraq. The same thing with Iran supporting Shias in Iraq as well. So the governments have to worry not only about what happens inside their borders, but what happens outside too. The second problem of the Sykes-Picot Agreement is that it created weak, fragile states. When we say weak, fragile states, what we mean is the government is not in control of its population and territory. Basically, there's a lack of security. It's particularly the case in countries like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya, where the government's its political and economic system is so weak that it's no longer in control of its territory. The governments cannot effectively enforce security or enforce the rule of law, and there's large parts of these territories which are just beyond the control of the government. And in these populations, there's a large degree of an absence of security. And in this security vacuum, you have the mobilization of militia and rebel groups. So governments in weak, fragile states in the Middle East and North Africa tend to suffer from either or actually both of these two things. One is weak legitimacy, and the other one is not a major producer of oil. 46% of the world's oil reserves are in the 5 Gulf states. So Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. However, there are countries in the Middle East that are not major oil producing, like Yemen, Egypt, and Syria. Now, the problem is that if these countries do not have oil, they often lack the capacity to build a functioning state. Let's look at Saudi Arabia, for example. So Saudi Arabia was just a desert, basically, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And then the House of Saud, they won and took control of this huge territory. And ultimately, in the 1930s, Saudi Arabia discovered oil. And what it happens is that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia could then, so when it discovered oil, it enabled Saudi Arabia and the government to create estates. And what I mean by that is like providing services to the population. Services like creating housing, creating infrastructure like roads, providing water, planning, economic developments, providing security to the population, providing employment through a huge civil service. And providing these services and creating the infrastructure of a state, this creates legitimacy for the governments. So the public benefit from these services, and then they see the government as legitimate. They give public support to the government. Now, many scholars believe that without oil, it is questionable whether the Saudi Arabian state would have even survived, because it just wouldn't have the resources to develop the states. Now, these countries, maybe Egypt a little less, but Egypt does suffer, and it's one of the reasons that it experienced the Arab Spring, but in particular Yemen and Syria really lack the capacity to build a functioning state. And for that reason, these governments did not have much legitimacy and support because the population didn't receive benefits from the governments. So basically, oil enables governments to buy public support.